The sky that day was unusually clear, as if nature was trying to conceal something unsettling. Golden rays of sunlight pierced through the ancient oak trees outside the small suburban church, illuminating the stone path leading to the altar. St. Augustine's Church, with its silver gray dome and vibrant stained glass windows, stood silently amidst the dry fields, a mute witness to untold stories. Today was the day everyone in this small town had been waiting for: the wedding of Maya Johnson and Daniel Carter. Maya, a 28-year-old black woman, stepped out of a vintage white car adorned with bright red roses. Her pristine white wedding dress hugged her slender figure, the light silk fabric fluttering in the wind like a drifting cloud. Her dark curly hair was pulled up high, accented with sparkling pearls, highlighting her healthy brown skin. Her eyes, deep and bright as two black gems, shone with happiness tinged with a subtle anxiety that went unnoticed. She clutched a bouquet of carnations, her fingers trembling slightly as she crossed the heavy wooden doors of the church. The rhythmic tapping of her high heels on the cold stone floor echoed, blending with a whistling wind through the cracks, like a prelude to something about to shatter. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of lilies and half-burnt candles. Over 100 guests, from close relatives to longtime friends, filled the polished wooden pews. They whispered to each other, exchanging smiles, curious glances, and heartfelt blessings. A few mischievous children darted through the aisle, scattering decorative petals, prompting gentle scolding from the adults. At the end of the aisle, Daniel stood tall and imposing in a perfectly tailored black suit. He was 32, with a chiseled face, piercing blue eyes, and neatly combed golden hair. His hands were tucked into his pockets, but upon closer inspection, his fingers were clenched as if he was suppressing something. No one noticed this detail. They only saw a handsome groom, ready to embrace the love of his life. Grace, Maya's mother, sat in the front row on the bride's side. She wore an elegant teal AO dye, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes red with emotion. She had raised Maya alone after her husband died in a car accident 10 years ago, and today was the first time she had seen her daughter truly happy since that fateful day. Beside her was Ethan, Maya's older brother, a tall, lean man with short hair streaked with silver at the temples. He wore a gray suit, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, as if searching for something amiss. Ethan had always been his sister's protector, and today he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept into his heart. The organ began to play, a traditional Handel wedding march, solemn and emotional. All eyes turned to the main doors as Maya appeared. She walked slowly, each step measured, her lips pressed into a thin line. The guests applauded enthusiastically, some even standing to take photos. Laughter and gasps of admiration mingled, creating a joyful chorus. But amidst all the noise, there was a sound that went unnoticed. The wind outside grew stronger, carrying dry leaves that rattled against the stained glass windows, making dry, sharp clacks like a warning from fate. Daniel watched Maya approach, but his gaze was not that of a man in love. There was something dark, deep, like a storm brewing inside him. He gritted his teeth, his jaw clenched, and his hands slowly emerged from his pockets. A close friend of his, sitting in the second row, noticed the change. "Is Daniel okay?" He whispered to the person next to him, but the question was quickly drowned out by the applause as Maya stopped before the altar. The officiant, an elderly priest with white hair, smiled kindly. He began his speech, his warm voice echoing through the space. "We gather here today to witness the sacred union of two souls, Maya Johnson and Daniel Carter, in love and trust." But as he spoke the word trust, Daniel suddenly turned his head, staring directly at Maya with eyes as sharp as knives. She froze, her hands gripping the bouquet tighter, feeling a chill emanating from the man she was about to call her husband. No one noticed this moment except for Ethan. He leaned forward, his eyebrows furrowed. "Something's wrong," he muttered, but Grace pulled his arm down, whispering, "Don't ruin her happy day." Ethan reluctantly sat back, but his eyes remained fixed on Daniel. The vows began. Maya spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. "I, Maya Johnson, promise to love and cherish you, Daniel Carter, in wealth and in poverty, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." She paused, smiling weakly, her eyes glistening with tears. The guests awed with emotion, some wiping away tears with handkerchiefs. But when it was Daniel's turn, the atmosphere suddenly changed. He took a deep breath, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I, Daniel Carter." He paused, his voice hoarse, as if suppressing a surge of anger. Maya tilted her head, her eyes showing a hint of confusion. "Daniel?" she whispered, but he didn't respond. Instead, he leaned down, whispering something in her ear that no one else could hear. Maya's face turned pale, her eyes widened, and her trembling hands dropped the bouquet to the floor. And then, like a lightning bolt tearing through the peaceful sky, Daniel raised his hand. A sharp, powerful slap echoed, silencing the entire church. Maya fell to the floor, her wedding dress spreading out like a stained cloud. Blood trickled from the corner of her lip, dripping onto the cold stone floor. Grace's scream shattered the silence. "No, my daughter!" She lunged forward, but tripped over the pews, falling heavily. Ethan jumped up, his eyes bloodshot, shouting, "What did you do, Daniel?" The guests panicked. A woman clutching her child ran for the door. A man shouted to call the police. The organ stopped abruptly, replaced by the sounds of wooden chairs being pushed aside, cries, and screams, a symphony of terror. Daniel stood there, breathing heavily, his hands trembling, but his eyes showed no remorse. He growled, "She deceived me. She doesn't deserve it." Maya, still on the floor, raised her head. Her eyes were no longer those of a happy bride. They were red, glistening with tears, but inside was a smoldering fire, a fire of hurt, anger, and unexpected strength. She touched the blood on her lip, looked at Daniel, and whispered, "You'll regret this." The wind outside had now become a gale, battering against the stained glass windows, shattering a small pane. Shards of glass fell to the floor, sparkling like tears of fate. No one knew that this was just the beginning of a horrific tragedy, where love, trust, and the lives of those in this church would be consumed by the flames of truth and revenge. The slap from Daniel's blow still echoed through the space of St. Augustine's Church, like an invisible knife severing all the joy and hope that had once been present on this wedding day. Maya lay there on the cold stone floor, her pristine white wedding dress now stained with blood from her torn lip. Her eyes were wide open, not from physical pain, but from the horror and betrayal that were tearing her heart apart. Blood dripped onto the floor, mingling with the scattered carnation petals, creating a tragic tableau amidst what should have been a sacred scene. Daniel stood towering over her, his breath heavy, his hands still trembling from the blow. His deep blue eyes were no longer those of a loving groom, but those of a man consumed by rage. "You think I'm a fool?" he roared, his voice hoarse, echoing through the cold stone walls. "You think I don't know about you and that guy?" His accusation was like a bullet fired into the crowd, freezing all the guests in shock. Grace, Maya's mother, struggled to her feet, her silver hair disheveled from the fall. She lunged at Daniel, her frail hands trembling as she grabbed his collar. "How dare you hit my daughter?" she screamed, her voice breaking with pain and outrage. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face, but Daniel didn't flinch. He shoved Grace away, causing her to fall again, her head hitting the edge of a wooden pew with a dry thump. Blood began to seep from her temple, a dark red stain spreading quickly on the floor. Screams from a few guests mingled with the wails of a child in the corner. Ethan, Maya's brother, could no longer restrain himself. He jumped up from his seat, his eyes bloodshot like a cornered beast. "You're dead," he roared, pushing through the panicked crowd to leap at Daniel. The two men wrestled in the aisle, the sound of punches tearing fabric, and Ethan's shouts creating a symphony of violence. Ethan landed a hard blow to Daniel's face, staggering him, but Daniel retaliated with an elbow to Ethan's chest, sending him crashing down near the altar. The flickering candles on the altar were knocked over, the small flames beginning to lick at the dark red carpet, but no one noticed in the chaos. The guests were no longer well-wishers. They had become a terrified mob, pushing and shoving to escape the church. A middle-aged woman, in a magnificent pink dress, clutched her child and ran towards the door, only to be accidentally knocked down by a large man. The child's cries rang out, drowned by the sound of overturned wooden chairs and shattering glass as someone threw a vase against the wall in panic. A man shouted, "Call the police! Call the police!" But the phone signal in this suburban area was too weak, and no one knew what to do but run. Maya, from the floor, slowly pushed herself up. Her legs trembled, her wedding dress now torn at the front, revealing a bruise forming on her knee. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just silently stared at Daniel with a look that would send shivers down anyone's spine, the look of someone who had lost everything. Blood still flowed from her lip, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she took a step towards Daniel, her voice hoarse but cold. "You said I deceived you? Then tell me, what did I do?" Daniel stopped fighting with Ethan, turning to her. He pulled his phone from his suit pocket, his hands shaking as he unlocked the screen. "You want proof? Here." He held up the phone, the screen brightly displaying a photo. Maya embracing a strange man in a cafe, her eyes in the photo shining with a happy smile. Below the photo was the caption, "She's carrying his child. Congratulations, you foolish groom." Whispers spread through the remaining crowd, some eyes turning to Maya with contempt, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "That's not true," Maya screamed, her voice breaking with pain. She lunged to snatch the phone from Daniel's hand, but he held it tight, pushing her away again. "Stop pretending," Daniel growled. "I saw it all. You think I'll let you make a fool of me?" He threw the phone to the floor, the screen shattering, small shards of glass scattering like fragments of their lives. Grace, from the floor, weakly called her daughter's name. "Maya, my child." She tried to crawl towards her, but her frail arms had no strength left. Ethan, just recovering from Daniel's blow, rushed to help his mother. He looked at Maya, then at Daniel, his eyes burning with hatred. "You'll pay?" he whispered, his voice like a curse. But Daniel didn't care. He stepped closer to Maya, bending down, his face inches from hers. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I trusted you. I loved you. And you repay me like this?" His hot breath hit Maya's face, but she didn't back away. Instead, she raised her head, looked him straight in the eyes, and whispered, "You don't know anything, Daniel, and you'll regret not believing me." The fire from the carpet had spread, black smoke billowing, obscuring the church. A crack echoed as a wooden beam in the ceiling, weakened by the heat, broke and fell near the altar, narrowly missing a group of guests huddled in the corner. Screams erupted again, but this time it was the scream of survival. "Fire! Run!" Someone yelled, and the remaining crowd surged towards the main doors, pushing so hard that the heavy wooden doors burst open, an elderly man falling outside, blood flowing from his forehead after hitting the door frame. Maya rose again, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't run like the others. She stepped towards Daniel, despite the smoke and flames drawing closer. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice no longer trembling, but as sharp as a knife. "I'll show you the truth. But not today." She turned her back, walking past Grace and Ethan, her bare feet stepping on broken glass, blood from her feet mixing with the blood from her lip, leaving a red trail on the floor. Daniel shouted after her, "Don't even think about escaping. I'll make you pay." But his voice was drowned by the roaring wind outside and the crackling flames. Ethan helped Grace to her feet, pulling her out of the church, but his eyes never left Daniel a silent promise of revenge. Maya paused at the threshold, turning to look at Daniel one last time. In her eyes, there was no more love, no more hope, only a deep pain and a smoldering fire of vengeance. Black smoke now filled the church, the distant sound of sirens growing faint. St. Augustine's Church, which should have been the beginning of a love story, had become an arena of tragedy and blood. And it was only the beginning. Thick black smoke filled St. Augustine's Church, like a death shroud slowly descending upon everything that had once held sacred meaning on this wedding day. The flames from the red carpet now raged, licking at the polished wooden pews, turning them into blazing columns of fire. The crackling sound of burning would mingled with the desperate screams of those trapped inside, creating a symphony of despair. The main doors, though forced open by the crowd, now became a deadly trap as smoke and fire blocked the final escape route. Maya stood at the threshold, her bloodied bare feet stepping on broken glass, her red eyes gazing back at the ravaged scene behind her. Her tattered wedding dress was no longer a symbol of happiness, but a blood-soaked rag. She had just turned her head to look at Daniel one last time, her eyes a sentence not a plea for forgiveness, but a promise of retribution beyond his imagination. But before she could step fully outside, a terrifying crash echoed. A crossbeam from the church ceiling, consumed by fire, collapsed in the middle of the aisle, blocking the escape of dozens of people inside. Grace, Maya's mother, lay on the floor near the altar, the blood from the wound on her temple spreading into a small pool around her head. She weakly called her daughter's name, her frail hands reaching out as if trying to grasp a final glimmer of hope. "Maya, don't go." Her voice faded, drowned out by the roaring fire and the screams of others. Ethan, Maya's brother, knelt beside her, his trembling hands cradling his mother. He turned his head to look at Maya, his eyes filled with pain and anger. "You can't leave Mom behind," he shouted, but his voice was hoarse from the smoke, barely audible. Daniel, still standing near the altar, ignored the encroaching flames. He looked at Maya, his deep blue eyes now bloodshot from the smoke and his unquenched rage. "Where do you think you're going?" he roared, stepping over the debris to approach her. But at that moment, a loud explosion erupted behind him. The small gas canister used for lighting in the church exploded when the flames reached it. The force of the explosion threw Daniel to the ground, his head hitting the edge of the altar, blood flowing from his forehead. He groaned in pain, but still tried to crawl up, clutching a charred piece of wood as a weapon. The remaining guests in the church were now completely out of control. A middle-aged man, in a sweat-soaked gray suit, lunged at the side door, but it was locked. He pounded frantically on the door, shouting, "Open it! Please open it!" A woman huddled in the corner with her child, crying and begging for salvation from God, but her prayers were drowned out by the shattering glass as a stained glass window on the wall exploded from the heat. Sharp shards of glass rained down, piercing the shoulder of a man trying to escape, causing him to fall to the floor, blood spreading around him. Maya turned back when she heard Ethan scream. She saw her mother lying there, motionless, and her heart clenched. "Mom!" she screamed, her voice breaking with pain. She rushed back inside. Despite the flames blocking her path and the black smoke making her cough violently, Ethan tried to drag Grace out of danger, but she was too weak, her legs unable to support her. "Go, Ethan, save Maya," Grace whispered, her eyes closing, her breath fading. Ethan wailed, "No, I won't leave you." He hugged her tightly, tears streaming down his smoke-streaked face. Daniel, from the debris, crawled up with a bloodied face. He saw Maya return, and a twisted smile appeared on his lips. "You can't escape," he mumbled, still clutching the charred wood. He lunged towards her, but the flames had reached his feet, setting his suit jacket on fire. He screamed in pain, falling again, but his eyes remained locked on Maya, like a predator refusing to give up its prey. Maya ran to Ethan and Grace, kneeling beside her mother. She took Grace's hand, the coldness making her shudder. "Mom, please, don't leave me," she cried, tears mixing with the blood and smoke on her face. But Grace didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her final breath leaving her body as the flames drew closer. Ethan screamed in despair, clutching his mother's body, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Mom!" His scream tore through the space, but no one could hear it amidst the roaring fire and the collapsing wood. A second explosion erupted from behind the altar. Another gas canister detonated, shaking the entire church. The ceiling began to collapse in chunks, burning wooden beams falling like arrows from hell. A beam pierced the leg of a man trying to escape, pinning him to the floor. His screams echoed, but within seconds, the flames engulfed him, turning his screams into a horrifying silence. Maya saw this, and a primal fear surged within her. But she didn't run. She turned to Ethan, shouting, "You have to go. Take Mom outside." Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his smoke-blackened face. "No, I won't leave you with that bastard." He pointed towards Daniel, who was now crawling towards them, his face disfigured by blood and fire. But at that moment, a large section of the ceiling collapsed, falling on Daniel. He screamed, pinned beneath the burning wood, but still struggled, clawing as if to break free and continue his pursuit of Maya. Maya grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him to his feet. "Let's go," she screamed, her voice lost in the smoke and fire. Ethan, though unwilling, still carried Grace's body, following his sister. They rushed through the flames, the smoke stinging their eyes, the heat scorching their skin. A shard of glass from a shattered window fell, cutting deep into Maya's arm, blood flowing, but she didn't stop. She pushed Ethan out of the main doors, now only a narrow escape route amidst the debris. Outside, the wind howled, carrying ash and smoke from the burning church. A few survivors huddled a few meters away, crying and embracing, but no one dared to go back to save those trapped inside. The sound of distant fire truck sirens echoed, but it was too late. Maya and Ethan fell to the dry grass outside, smoke still clinging to their lungs. Ethan laid Grace's body on the ground, his trembling hands caressing her face one last time. "Mom, why?" he mumbled, his voice breaking with pain. Maya knelt beside him, her empty eyes staring at her mother's body. But then she turned her head, looking back at the collapsing church. Through the flames and black smoke, she saw Daniel's silhouette. He was still alive, though trapped under the burning wood. His eyes met hers, And in that moment, she saw not remorse, but a burning hatred. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice weak but threatening, before the flames completely engulfed him. St. Augustine's church collapsed completely soon after, the final explosion sounding like an end to the fateful wedding day. Maya hugged Ethan tightly, the last tears falling down her smoke-streaked face. But inside her, another fire was burning, the fire of revenge, of an unquenchable pain. And she knew this was not the end, but the beginning of a new nightmare. The sky outside St. Augustine's church was no longer clear. Gray clouds rolled in, obscuring the once radiant morning sunlight, as if nature itself was mourning the tragedy that had just occurred. The church, now a charred ruin, still smoldered, the smell of burning wood and human flesh mingling in the air, causing the survivors huddled on the dry grass a few meters away to retch uncontrollably. The sirens of fire trucks and ambulances grew closer, but for Maya and Ethan, it was too late. Maya knelt beside Grace's body, her trembling hands clutching her mother's cold hand. Blood from the glass cut on her arm, and her torn lip had dried into dark red streaks on her brown skin, mixed with the ash that covered her face. Her tattered wedding dress now resembled a shroud more than a symbol of happiness. Her eyes were empty, but deep inside, a smoldering fire burned, not the fire of sadness, but of hatred and determination. Ethan sat beside her, his head buried in his mother's body, tears streaming down his smoke-streaked face. "Why, Mom?" He mumbled, his voice breaking like a child who had lost everything. The remaining survivors stood scattered around them, some crying, others whispering to each other in horror. A middle-aged man, his gray suit torn at the arm, hugged his wife and muttered, "I told you we shouldn't have come. I told you." A child, his white shirt now black with smoke, sat huddled under an oak tree, his eyes blankly staring at the ruins. The fire trucks finally arrived, firefighters rushing into the ashes, but they found only charred bodies. No one was alive inside. Maya raised her head when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. A firefighter, his face sweaty under his helmet, stopped in front of her and Ethan. "We found someone alive," he said, his voice deep but hesitant. "He's trapped under the wood, badly burned, but still breathing." Maya and Ethan turned their heads simultaneously, their eyes wide with surprise and anger. "Who?" Ethan growled, jumping to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. "Daniel Carter," the firefighter replied, his eyes showing a hint of pity. "He's being taken to the ambulance. His condition is critical, but he's still alive." The word struck Maya like a knife. She stood up, her bare feet trembling on the dry grass, and looked towards the ambulance a few meters away. Through the crowd of paramedics, she saw Daniel's silhouette, his face disfigured by fire, one cheek charred black, blood flowing from his forehead and mouth. He lay on a stretcher, his eyes closed, but his chest still rising and falling weakly. "He's not dead," Maya whispered, her voice so cold that even Ethan shuddered. Ethan rushed to Maya, grabbing her shoulders. "He has to pay, Maya. He killed Mom, killed everyone," he shouted, tears welling up again, but Maya didn't respond. She just stared at Daniel, her eyes piercing through him, as if looking into a dark future she had decided to paint herself. "He will pay," she said, her voice dropping, but not in the way you think. Before Ethan could ask further, another scream erupted from the crowd. A young woman, her purple dress torn, ran towards Maya and Ethan, holding a phone with a shattered screen. "I found this in the ruins," she shouted, her voice breaking with panic. "It fell out of Daniel's pocket." Maya took the phone, her hand trembling as she turned it on. The cracked screen lit up, displaying the photo Daniel had shown her in the church, the photo of her embracing a strange man, with the caption, "She's carrying his child. Congratulations, you foolish groom." Ethan snatched the phone, his eyes bloodshot. "What is this? Who did this?" he shouted, but Maya raised her hand to stop him. She looked closely at the photo, and a faint memory flashed in her mind. The man in the photo was not a secret lover, not a betrayer. It was Ethan, her brother, during a meeting at a cafe to discuss a surprise gift for Daniel before the wedding. The photo had been edited, Ethan's face replaced with a stranger, but his eyes and smile were unmistakable. "It's you," Maya whispered, turning to Ethan. He looked at her, then at the photo, his face pale. "What? How could?" Before he could finish, Maya scrolled through the messages on the phone. An unknown number had sent this photo to Daniel just before the wedding, along with a series of inflammatory messages. "She's been deceiving you from the start. She doesn't love you. Cancel the wedding, or you'll be a laughingstock." The last message, sent just minutes before Maya entered the church, read, "Act now, Daniel. Don't let her win." Ethan collapsed onto the grass, his hands covering his face. "Who did this? Who wants to destroy us?" He roared, but Maya didn't answer. She looked at the phone, then at Daniel in the ambulance. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place, a familiar voice, a sinister smile she had seen in the past. "It's not a coincidence," she whispered, her voice so cold that the young woman standing next to her took a few steps back. The ambulance sirens wailed as they prepared to take Daniel away. But at that moment, a figure emerged from the crowd, a tall, slender man, wearing a black coat, his face hidden by a hood. He approached Maya and Ethan, his deep voice echoing. "You want to know who's behind all this? I have proof." Maya turned her head, her eyes sharp. "Who are you?" she asked, but the man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, throwing it at her feet. "Open it. The truth is inside." Ethan lunged forward, trying to grab the man, but he retreated as quickly as a ghost, disappearing into the crowd before anyone could react. Maya bent down to pick up the USB drive, her hand clutching it as if it were the key to all the answers. "We have to see this," she said to Ethan, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a terrifying premonition. The ambulance carrying Daniel drove away, the sirens fading into the howling wind. But Maya didn't care about him anymore. She turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing. "This isn't your fault, and it's not my fault. Someone else wants us dead, not just Daniel, but our whole family." Ethan looked at her, then at Grace's body lying on the grass, tears welling up again. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice breaking. Maya stood up straight, the USB drive in her hand like a declaration of war. "We find that person," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "And when we do, we'll make them pay at any cost." She turned her head to look at the ruins of the church, where dozens had died, where her mother had died, and where her love had been betrayed. A cold wind blew, carrying ash and the smell of burning, but Maya didn't shiver. In her heart, pain had turned into a weapon sharper than any flame. Ethan stood up, wiping his tears, his hands clenched into fists. "He won't get away," he whispered, his eyes no longer those of a gentle brother, but of someone ready to step into the darkness to seek justice. Maya nodded, and the two siblings stood there, amidst the devastation, like two ghosts surviving from hell with nothing left to lose, only revenge to live for. From afar, the hoarse laughter of someone hidden in the shadows echoed, but no one heard. His plan was not over, and Maya, Ethan, and Daniel, the last pawns, still didn't know they were stepping into a deadly game, where the truth was more horrifying than the flames that had just consumed St. Augustine's church. The cold wind blew across the dry grass outside the ruins of St. Augustine's church, carrying ash and the acrid smell of death. Maya stood there, the small USB drive in her hand clenched like a ticking bomb. Her eyes, red from smoke and tears, were no longer those of a wounded bride. They burned with a fierce fire, the fire of rage, of determination, and of an unspoken vow. She would not let the person behind it all escape justice. Beside her, Ethan cradled Grace's body, his hands trembling but his eyes as hard as steel. They were no longer people who had come to bless a wedding. They were survivors from hell, pushed to the brink of life and death. The ambulance carrying Daniel had faded into the distance, blending with the fire truck sirens and the scattered cries of the remaining survivors. But Maya didn't care about Daniel anymore. He, with his face disfigured by fire and hatred, was now just a small piece in the horrific puzzle she was trying to piece together. The USB drive in her hand, a gift from the mysterious man, was the key to the truth, and she knew it would not only reveal the mastermind, but could also destroy everything left inside her. Ethan stood up, wiping his tears with his torn sleeve, and looked at Maya with determined eyes. "We need a place to watch this," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "We have to know who's behind this and why." Maya nodded, saying nothing. She turned her back on the ruins, where dozens had died, where her mother had perished in the flames, and walked away. Ethan hurried after her, carrying Grace's body in his arms, as if unwilling to leave his mother in that ravaged scene. They found an old fire truck parked nearby. The driver, a middle-aged man with a sweaty face, was distributing water to the survivors. Seeing Maya and Ethan, he stopped, his eyes showing a hint of pity. "Are you all right?" he asked, but then he saw Grace's body in Ethan's arms, and his voice trailed off. "God, I'm sorry." Maya didn't respond. She held up the USB drive, her voice cold. "We need a computer. Now." The driver hesitated, but Maya's sharp eyes made him unable to refuse. He led them into the truck's cabin, where an old laptop was connected to a backup power source. "Use it," he said, then turned away, leaving the two siblings in the cramped space, thick with the smell of engine oil and smoke. Ethan placed Grace's body on the truck floor, his hands trembling as he smoothed her silver hair one last time. "Mom will rest in peace," he whispered, "but not now." Maya plugged the USB drive into the laptop, the screen flickering to life. A simple folder appeared, containing only a single video file, no name, just a random string of numbers. She clicked on the file, and the screen went black for a few seconds before a blurry image appeared. The speakers crackled, emitting a man's voice, deep, cold, and sinister. "If you're watching this, Daniel, then the plan has succeeded," the voice began. "She's dead, or at least destroyed. And you're my perfect tool." Ethan clenched his fist, gritting his teeth. "Who the hell is this?" he growled, but Maya raised her hand, signaling him to be quiet. The video continued, and the image gradually sharpened. It was a dark room, with only his silhouette sitting in front of the camera, his face obscured by shadows. But that voice, Maya felt an electric shock run down her spine. She had heard it before, somewhere in the past, but couldn't remember exactly where. "I know you love her, Daniel," the voice continued, "and that's your weakness. I sent the photo, a little editing, but enough to drive you crazy. She's not pregnant, didn't betray you. But you'll never believe her, will you? You're too easily manipulated." A hoarse laugh echoed, making Maya shiver. "And when you hit her, when you destroy everything, you'll drag her whole family down to hell with you. That's my gift to them." Ethan slammed his hand on the truck floor, tears welling up again. "He wants to kill our whole family. He wants us all dead." But Maya didn't cry. She stared at the screen, her hands clenched in a fist so tightly that her nails dug into her skin, blood dripping in small drops. The video wasn't over. The man in the shadows leaned forward, and though his face was still obscured, a small detail came into view: a silver ring on his left hand, engraved with the letter R. Maya froze, her memory jolted awake. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan turned to her, his eyes confused. "What? Who's Richard?" Maya didn't answer immediately. She jumped up, rushing out of the truck cabin, her bare feet stepping on dry grass and sharp pebbles, but she didn't feel the pain. In her mind, the pieces began to fall into place. Richard, an old friend of Daniel, who had secretly loved her but was rejected by her 3 years ago. He had disappeared afterward, without a word of farewell, but his jealous eyes and twisted smile still haunted her dreams. Ethan ran after her, shouting, "Maya, what do you know? Tell me." She stopped, turning to look at him, her eyes burning. "Richard Marshall," she said, her voice cold. "He's Daniel's best friend. He loved me, but I didn't love him. He hates me, hates our whole family for supporting me and Daniel." Ethan stood still, his arms hanging limp. "So all this is for revenge?" Maya nodded, but before she could say more, a loud noise erupted from the ruins. A black car sped out of the nearby trail, its headlights shining directly at them. The car door opened, and the man in the black coat, the one who had given them the USB drive, stepped out. This time he didn't hide. He pulled down his hood, revealing his face: a man in his 40s, with short gray hair and deep-set eyes. "You've seen it," he said, his voice deep. "Now you know." Maya lunged forward, grabbing his collar. "Who are you? Why did you give us this?" she shouted, the last of her tears spilling out, but not from sadness, but from uncontrollable rage. The man didn't resist. He looked at her, his eyes showing a hint of pain. "I'm the only survivor from Richard's team," he said. "My name is Paul. He hired me to follow you, take photos, edit them. But I didn't expect him to go this far." Ethan stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Where is he? Tell me, or I'll kill you right now." Paul shook his head, his voice trembling. "He's not here. He watched everything from afar through cameras in the church. He wanted to see you suffer, wanted to see your family collapse. But when the fire broke out, he thought you were dead. He didn't know you were alive." Maya released Paul's collar, her hands trembling. "Cameras?" she repeated, her voice breaking. Paul nodded, pointing towards the ruins. "He installed them all over the church. He wanted to record the moment Daniel hit you, the moment everything fell apart. He's a sick bastard." Maya turned her head to look at the ruins, and a horrifying image flashed in her mind: Richard, sitting somewhere in the darkness, laughing maniacally as he watched her mother die, as he watched her fall in blood and fire. She turned back, lunging at Paul again, but this time she didn't grab his collar. She snatched a dagger from his belt, holding it to his throat. "Take me to him," she growled, her voice no longer that of a victim, but of a predator. "Take me, or I swear I'll slit your throat right here." Paul raised his hands, his eyes panicked. All right, I'll take you. He's at a warehouse 20 miles away, near the Hudson River. But you have to be careful he's not alone." Ethan stepped forward, placing his hand on Maya's shoulder. "We'll go together," he said, his voice dropping. "He won't escape." Maya nodded, lowering the dagger, but her eyes still locked on Paul. "Get in the car," she ordered, and Paul didn't dare refuse. He returned to the black car, opening the door for them. Maya and Ethan got into the car, leaving Grace's body on the grass, a silent promise that they would return after justice was served. The car sped away in the howling wind, leaving the ruins of the church behind. In Maya's heart, Pain had turned into a storm that wouldn't stop until she faced Richard, the one who had killed her mother, destroyed her life, and turned her wedding day into a nightmare. The climax had arrived, and she knew that this battle would not end with forgiveness, but with blood. The black car sped along the rough trail leading to the Hudson River, its wheels crunching on gravel, creating dry sounds that mingled with the wind whistling through the half-open windows. Inside the car, the atmosphere was as heavy as a furnace, though no one spoke a word. Maya sat in the front seat, her red eyes staring straight ahead, her right hand clutching Paul's dagger so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Dried blood from her arm and torn lips still clung to her brown skin, mixed with ash from St. Augustine's church, a constant reminder of what she had lost. Ethan sat in the back seat, his hands covering his head, his eyes empty, but his lips pressed tightly as if suppressing a surge of rage. Paul, the driver, gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands, his eyes constantly glancing at Maya through the rearview mirror, as if afraid the dagger in her hand would suddenly be at his throat. The road narrowed as they approached the riverbank. Tall pine trees grew densely on both sides, obscuring the dim light of the late afternoon, turning the landscape into a dark, menacing tunnel. The sound of water flowing from the Hudson River echoed from afar, blending with the roaring engine, creating a soundtrack for this journey of revenge. "How much further?" Maya asked, her voice cold, cutting through the suffocating silence. Paul swallowed, his voice trembling. "About 5 minutes. The warehouse is at the end of this road. But I told you he's not alone." Ethan raised his head, his eyes flashing with anger. "How many people does he have?" He growled, his hand gripping the seat. Paul shook his head, his eyes panicked. "I'm not sure. 3, maybe 4. He hired mercenaries, not the ordinary kind. He has money, and he's crazy." Maya turned to look at Paul, her eyes as sharp as a knife. "He's crazy? Good. I'll show him what real crazy is." The car stopped in front of an old warehouse located by the riverbank. The dilapidated wooden building, with its rusty, corrugated iron roof, showed signs of wear, but the faint light emanating from the cracks in the walls indicated that it was not empty. The hum of a generator echoed from afar, blending with the sound of the nearby river. Maya stepped out of the car first, her bare feet stepping on the cold, damp ground, ignoring the pain from the cuts on her soles. She clenched the dagger, her eyes scanning the warehouse like a predator sniffing out its prey. Ethan followed, his hands unarmed, but his shoulders tense, as if ready to pounce on anyone who dared to stand in his way. Paul hesitated at the car door, his eyes darting between Maya and the warehouse. "I'm not going in," he whispered. "I've done enough." Maya turned back, lunging at Paul as fast as lightning. She held the dagger to his throat, the tip lightly piercing his skin, a drop of bright red blood trickling down. "You're coming with us," she growled, her voice trembling with rage. "You're part of this. You don't get to run away." Paul raised his hands, his face pale. All right, I'll go." Maya released him, but her eyes remained locked on him, a warning that any act of betrayal would be paid with his life. The three approached the warehouse's main door, a heavy wooden plank riddled with cracks. Maya signaled to Ethan and Paul to stand on either side, then kicked the door open. The sound of splintering wood echoed, the door bursting open, revealing a dark space inside, illuminated only by a few bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The stench of engine oil and cigarettes wafted out, mixed with hoarse laughter echoing from the back of the warehouse. Maya stepped in first, the dagger in her hand glinting in the dim light, her eyes scanning every dark corner. Inside, three men in black stood around an old wooden table, on which a large screen displayed footage from St. Augustine's Church, flames raging, black smoke billowing, and the image of Grace falling in a pool of blood. One of them, tall with short red hair, laughed loudly at the sight. "Look at that old hag," he said, his voice full of contempt. "Died like a rat." The other two laughed along, unaware of the three figures who had just entered. But in the far corner of the warehouse, another man sat in an old armchair, his back to the door. He wore a long gray coat, his hand bearing a silver ring engraved with the letter R. Richard Marshall. He didn't laugh, didn't speak, just silently watched the screen, his hands clasped as if enjoying a perfect play. Maya's footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, and finally, Richard turned his head. His face was revealed in the light a man in his mid-30s, with slicked-back black hair, cold light blue eyes, and a twisted, sinister smile. "Maya," he said, his voice deep but sickeningly sweet. "You're alive. How unexpected." Maya stopped, about 10 steps away from Richard. She didn't respond immediately, just stared at him, her eyes blazing as if to burn him on the spot. Ethan lunged forward, shouting, "Who the hell are you? You killed my mother." But before he could get close, the two men at the table stood up, drawing guns from their belts. "Stay still," one of them growled, pointing his gun at Ethan. Paul retreated to the door, his eyes panicked, but Maya didn't move. She looked at Richard, and her voice rang out, as cold as ice. "Why?" Richard stood up, stepping closer to her, his hands in his coat pockets. The smile on his lips widened, revealing his white teeth in stark contrast to his deathly eyes. "Why?" he repeated, his voice full of mockery. "Because you chose him, Maya. You chose Daniel over me. Did you think I let you be happy with someone else after you rejected me? No, I wanted you to suffer more than any pain you could imagine." He pointed to the screen, where the image of Grace's charred body was still playing. "And I succeeded. Look at your mother, what a pity." Maya screamed, lunging at Richard with the dagger raised high. But before she could reach him, the red-haired man pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed her shoulder, blood spurting out, and she fell to the floor, the dagger slipping from her hand. Ethan roared, rushing at the gunman, but the other man punched him hard in the face, sending him crashing down. Paul screamed, "Stop! You're all crazy!" But no one listened. Richard stepped towards Maya, bending down, his face inches from hers. "You're stronger than I thought," he whispered, "but that just makes things more interesting." Maya, despite the pain, suddenly grabbed Richard's leg, pulling him off balance and sending him crashing down. She scrambled to her feet, picking up the dagger, and lunged at him again. This time, she plunged it into his shoulder, blood spurting out, and Richard screamed in pain. "You bitch!" he growled, but Maya didn't stop. She pulled the dagger out, ready to strike again, but the red-haired man lunged at her, pushing her to the floor. Ethan, from behind, picked up a wooden plank from the debris in the warehouse, slamming it into the man's head, knocking him unconscious. The warehouse was now a battlefield, blood splattered on the floor, screams and gunshots echoing. Paul ran to the door, shouting, "I don't want to die." But before he could escape, the third man fired a shot into his back. Paul collapsed, blood spreading around him. Maya saw this, and something inside her snapped. She stood up, ignoring the wound on her shoulder, and lunged at Richard again. This time, she pinned him to the floor, the dagger at his throat. "You're going to die," she growled, her voice trembling with rage. But Richard laughed a mad, sick laugh. "You think killing me is the end?" he whispered, blood dripping from his shoulder to the floor. "Daniel is alive, Maya. He'll find you. And when he knows what you did to me, he won't stop." Maya froze, her eyes wide. "What?" she asked, her voice breaking. Richard tilted his head, the smile on his lips more twisted than ever. He loves you, but he also hates you. I was just the beginning. He'll be the end. Ethan rushed forward, pulling Maya away from Richard. Don't listen to him, he shouted. Kill him. But before Maya could react, a loud explosion erupted from the back of the warehouse. A small bomb, set in the corner, detonated, shaking the entire building. The corrugated iron roof collapsed, pieces of wood and metal flying everywhere. Maya and Ethan were thrown to the ground, while Richard, though wounded, laughed maniacally amidst the debris. You can't defeat me, he shouted, before the smoke and dust engulfed everything. The warehouse began to burn, the flames spreading like a living monster. Maya grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him out of the rubble, but Richard disappeared in the black smoke. They rushed outside, falling onto the banks of the Hudson River, the cold water seeping into their skin. Maya turned her head to look at the burning warehouse, and in her heart, a new fear arose not for Richard, but for his final words. Daniel was alive, and this battle was far from over. The flames from the old warehouse on the banks of the Hudson River raged fiercely, turning the building into a blazing pillar of fire in the night. The sound of splintering wood and crunching metal mingled with the rushing water of the river, creating a symphony of destruction. Maya and Ethan lay sprawled on the riverbank, the icy water seeping through their tattered clothes, Maya's blood from her shoulder mixing with the water, spreading into faint red streaks. She gasped for breath, her bloodshot eyes fixed on the burning warehouse, where Richard, the one who had destroyed her life, had just disappeared into the black smoke. But his last words still echoed in her head, like a dagger piercing her heart. Daniel is alive. He'll find you. Ethan struggled to his feet, coughing from the smoke still clinging to his lungs. He grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her up, his eyes filled with pain and anger. Is he dead? He asked, his voice hoarse, pointing towards the ruins. Maya didn't answer immediately. She stared at the flames, her trembling hands clutching Richard's bloody dagger. If he's not dead, she whispered, her voice cold, I'll find him. And this time, I'll end it all. But before they could stand up, a sound erupted from the trail, the roar of an engine, bright headlights shining directly at them. A large truck sped towards them, screeching to a halt on the damp ground, dust billowing. The doors burst open, and 3 men in black stepped out, holding rifles, their sharp eyes scanning Maya and Ethan. Who are you? Ethan shouted, stepping in front of Maya, but he was unarmed, with nothing but his bare hands and the rage in his heart. The leader, a tall man with short gray hair and a scarred face, stepped closer. He didn't answer immediately, just gestured for the other two to surround them. Richard was right, he said, his voice deep but threatening. You're more stubborn than we thought, Maya Johnson. Maya stood up, ignoring the bleeding wound on her shoulder, the dagger in her hand raised and ready. Where is he? She growled. Where's Richard? The scar man smirked, his eyes narrowing. He's alive, but not here. He left as soon as the warehouse exploded a secret escape under the floor. He knew you wouldn't give up. He pointed towards the burning warehouse, where black smoke still billowed. He left us to clean up, but I don't like working for a madman forever. He turned to the other two, signaling them to lower their guns. I have an offer for you. Ethan lunged forward, trying to punch the man in the face, but Maya raised her hand to stop him. What offer? She asked, her voice cold but her eyes wary. The scarred man shrugged, pulling a small phone from his pocket, tossing it at her feet. Richard isn't the only one who wants you dead, he said. Daniel is alive, and he's on his way here. He woke up in the hospital an hour ago, crazy with the idea that you killed Richard. He hired us to find you, but I don't work for two madmen at the same time. Maya picked up the phone, the screen lighting up with a message just sent. Maya, I know you're alive. I'll find you, and this time I'll end everything. The message was from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakable. It was Daniel. Her heart clenched, not with fear, but with an old pain resurfacing. The man she once loved, once vowed to protect her, was now her sworn enemy. Ethan snatched the phone, read the message, and his hands trembled with anger. That bastard dares? He shouted, turning to the scarred man. You work for him. Do you know what's going on? The scarred man shook his head, his eyes showing a hint of weariness. I don't work for anyone anymore. I just want to live. Richard paid me to kill you. Daniel paid me to find you. But I've seen enough that church, your mother's death. It's all because of those two. I'm giving you this to make amends. Maya looked at the scar man, then at the phone. Make amends? She repeated, her voice full of sarcasm. You think a message can erase what you've done? You helped Richard kill my mother. She lunged forward, the dagger raised, but the scarred man didn't flinch. He stood still, his eyes locked on her. Kill me, if you want, he said, but if you want the truth, listen to me. Ethan pulled Maya back, his eyes darting between the scarred man and his sister. Talk, he growled. What do you know? The scar man took a deep breath, his voice dropping. Richard didn't just want revenge on you for rejecting him. He hates your whole family, your mother, your brother, everyone. 5 years ago, your father, Mr. Johnson, testified in a case that sent Richard's father to jail. He died in there, and Richard blames your family. He's been planning this for a long time, getting Daniel to love you, waiting for the wedding day to destroy everything. Maya froze, the dagger in her hand trembling. Memories of her father, the gentle man who died in a car accident, flooded back like a torrent. My father? She whispered, her voice breaking. The scarred man nodded. Yes. He didn't just want you to suffer, he wanted to wipe out your entire bloodline. Daniel was just a tool, a fool blinded by jealousy. But now, Daniel is out of Richard's control. He wants you dead, not because of Richard, but because he thinks you betrayed him. Ethan collapsed to the ground, his hands covering his head. Father, mother, all because of a case? He shouted, tears streaming down his face. We didn't do anything wrong. Maya didn't cry. She stood there, her eyes empty, staring at the scarred man. But inside her, a storm was raging. The truth was revealed, but it didn't bring relief, it only deepened her pain, turning it into an inextinguishable fire. The scar man turned back to his truck, signaling the other two to retreat. I'll leave you the truck, he said. Daniel is coming not far from here. If you want to live, run. If you want revenge, face him. But don't expect me to help anymore. He walked away, disappearing into the darkness with the other two, leaving Maya and Ethan with the truck and the still-lit phone screen. Maya picked up the phone, reread Daniel's message. She threw it to the ground, stomping on it until the screen shattered. He won't find me, she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. I'll find him first. Ethan stood up, grabbing her hand. What do we do now? He asked, his voice trembling, but his eyes hardened again. Maya turned her head to look at the Hudson River, where the faint moonlight reflected on the water. We go back for Mom's body, she said. We bury her, then we hunt down those two bastards, Richard and Daniel. They won't survive what they've done. Ethan nodded, his hands clenched into fists. All right, but what if Daniel gets here first? Before Maya could answer, another engine sound echoed from afar closer, more intense. A black Jeep sped out of the trail, its headlights shining directly at them. The door burst open, and Daniel stepped out. His face was disfigured by burns from the fire, one cheek char black, his left eye swollen shut, but his remaining eye, the deep blue eye that had once made Maya fall in love, was now bloodshot with hatred. He held a handgun, pointing it directly at Maya. "You're alive," he growled, his voice hoarse. But not for long. Maya didn't back down. She raised the dagger, blood from her shoulder dripping on her hand, but her eyes didn't waver. "You want me dead?" she shouted, her voice breaking with rage. "Then come and kill me." Ethan lunged forward, shouting no, but Daniel pulled the trigger. The bullet flew out, grazing Maya's head, cutting a lock of her hair that fell to the ground. She rushed at him, ignoring everything, the dagger in her hand raised high, and the two of them tumbled down the riverbank. The warehouse still burned behind them, the red flames illuminating this life or death battle. Ethan shouted, rushing to help Maya, but Daniel punched him hard in the face, sending him crashing into the water. Maya plunged the dagger into Daniel's arm, blood spurting out, and he screamed in pain. But he didn't drop the gun. He raised it, pressed it against her head, and whispered, "I love you, Maya, but I can't let you live." The gunshot echoed along the banks of the Hudson River, sharp and decisive, tearing through the silent night. Blood spread on the water, crimson under the faint moonlight, mingling with the icy flow of the river. Maya and Daniel tumbled onto the damp sand, their heavy breaths blending with the wind whistling through the tall pine trees. The dagger in Maya's hand remained buried deep in Daniel's arm, blood flowing from the wound, but the gun in his hand was still pressed against her head, a wisp of white smoke rising from the barrel after the recent shot. Ethan lay a few meters away, river water reaching his chest, blood flowing from his nose after Daniel's punch, his eyes wide with panic as he looked towards his sister. But Maya wasn't dead. The bullet had missed her. In the final moment, as Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, she had tilted her head, and the bullet had grazed past, just centimeters from her ear, leaving a burning mark on her skin. She was still alive, and now she pinned Daniel to the sand, the dagger in her hand, trembling but not leaving the wound on his arm. "You wanted to kill me?" she growled, her voice breaking with rage and pain. "Then do it. Finish it, Daniel." Daniel gasped for breath, his face distorted by fire and blood, twisted in pain. One of his eyes was swollen shut, but the other, the deep blue eye that had once made her heart flutter, was now bloodshot with hatred and an indescribable pain. "You betrayed me," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his hand still clutching the gun, though he no longer had the strength to raise it. "You and that guy, you kill me inside." He coughed up blood, red drops falling onto the sand, mixing with the river water rising from a small wave. Ethan struggled to his feet from the water, rushing towards Maya, shouting, "Kill him, Maya. He doesn't deserve to live." He grabbed Daniel's shoulder, trying to pull him away from his sister, but Maya raised her hand to stop him. "No, Ethan," she said, her voice dropping, cold but trembling. "He has to talk. He has to answer me." She leaned closer, her face inches from Daniel's, her hot breath brushing against his skin. "Who did this? Who turned you into this?" Daniel laughed, a weak, twisted, bitter laugh. "You want the truth?" he whispered, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Richard, he told me you were pregnant with someone else's child. He sent me a picture. I couldn't take it. I love you, Maya, but I couldn't let you make me a fool." He coughed violently, blood splattering on the sand, but his eyes remained locked on hers. "I was wrong, but you're not innocent either. You let me believe his lies." Maya froze, her hands trembling violently. Daniel's words were like another knife stabbing into her heart, not because they were true, but because they were the final proof of their complete breakdown. She had loved him so much that she was ready to give her whole life to him on their wedding day. But now, the man she once loved was dead, leaving only a creature consumed by jealousy and lies. You didn't believe me, she whispered, her last tears spilling out, rolling down her blood and ash-streaked face. You chose to believe Richard instead of me. And my mother died because of that stupid belief. Ethan shouted, kicking Daniel hard in the chest, making him cough up more blood. Don't listen to him, Maya. He killed Mom. He deserves to die. But Maya didn't move. She looked at Daniel, and in that moment, she saw not an enemy, but a broken human broken by the very suspicion and rage that Richard had sown in his heart. She pulled the dagger out of his arm, blood spurting out, and Daniel groaned in pain. But she didn't stab him again. She stood up, her legs trembling on the sand, and turned her back. Maya, Ethan shouted, his eyes bloodshot. What are you doing? Kill him. But Maya shook her head, her voice lost in the wind. No, Ethan. Killing him now is too easy. He has to live to see what he's done, to endure the pain I'm enduring. She threw the dagger into the water, the blade glinting one last time before sinking into the dark river. Daniel lay there, breathing weakly, blood spreading around him. He watched Maya, his eyes dimming with blood loss, and whispered, "You won't escape, Richard." But he didn't have the strength to finish the sentence. He collapsed onto the sand, motionless, but still alive, a shadow of the man who was supposed to be the groom on that fateful wedding day. Ethan rushed to Maya, grabbing her shoulders. "Are you crazy?" he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "He deserves to die. He and Richard killed Mom, killed everyone." Maya turned to him, looked at him, and for the first time since the church collapsed, she hugged him tightly. "Brother," she whispered, her voice breaking with pain, "killing him won't bring Mom back. But letting him live with his guilt, that's the only way I can bear it." Ethan buried his head in her shoulder, crying like a child. They stood there, on the cold riverbank, with Daniel's motionless body a few meters away and the flames from the warehouse still burning red in the distance. But the silence didn't last long. Another engine sound echoed closer, more intense. A black car sped out of the darkness, headlights shining directly at them. The door burst open, and Richard stepped out. He was no longer the composed man sitting in the warehouse. His left shoulder was bandaged haphazardly, blood seeping through the cloth from Maya's knife wound. His face pale, but his eyes still blazing with uncontrollable madness. He held a rifle, pointing it directly at Maya and Ethan. "You're strong," he said, his voice hoarse but full of sarcasm. "But you can't defeat me, Maya. Never." Maya released Ethan, standing opposite Richard. She had no weapon, nothing but her bare hands and the burning hatred in her heart. "You killed my mother," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You turned Daniel into a monster. You want me dead? Then do it. But I swear you won't survive tonight." Richard laughed loudly, the sound echoing across the riverbank. "You think I'm afraid of you?" he growled, raising his rifle. "I won from the moment you rejected me, from the moment your father destroyed my family. I killed your mother, ruined Daniel, and now I'll kill you and your damn brother." He pulled the trigger, but at that moment, Ethan lunged forward, pushing Maya to the sand. The bullet hit his shoulder, blood spurting out, and he collapsed into the water. "Ethan!" Maya screamed, rushing to him. She pulled him out of the water, blood flowing from his shoulder, mixing with the river water. He coughed up blood, but his eyes were still open, looking at her with a weak smile. "Run, Maya," he whispered, his voice fading. "Don't let him win." But Maya didn't run. She stood up, facing Richard, her eyes bloodshot like a cornered animal. Richard stepped closer, his rifle still pointed at her. "You have nothing left," he said, the smile on his lips twisted. "No mother, no brother, no love. Only me and you. And I'll be the last one standing." He raised his rifle, ready to pull the trigger again, but a sudden noise erupted from Daniel. Daniel, though weak and almost motionless, suddenly picked up the handgun lying on the sand. With his last bit of strength, he raised it, aiming at Richard. "No, you won't," he whispered, his voice weak but full of hatred. The gunshot rang out, and the bullet hit Richard in the chest. He screamed, collapsing onto the sand, blood spurting from the wound, the rifle slipping from his hand. Maya turned to look at Daniel, her eyes wide with shock. He looked at her, a twisted smile on his bloodied face. "I am sorry," he whispered before collapsing, his last breath leaving his body. Richard, a few meters away, was still alive, but blood flowed unceasingly from his chest. He laughed hoarsely, looking at Maya. "You still lose," he said, his voice fading. "I destroyed everything." Maya rushed to Richard, picking up his rifle. She stood over him, pointing the gun at his head, her hands trembling, but her eyes unwavering. "You're wrong," she said, her voice cold. "You didn't destroy me. You only made me stronger." She pulled the trigger, and the gunshot rang out one last time, ending Richard's life in a pool of blood on the riverbank. She dropped the rifle, turning back to Ethan. He was still breathing, but weakly. She cradled him in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Don't die, Ethan, please," she whispered. But Ethan only smiled, his hand grasping hers. "You did it," he said before his eyes closed, his breath ceasing in her arms. Maya screamed, her scream echoing across the riverbank, drowning out the sound of the flowing water and the wind. She hugged Ethan's lifeless body tightly, beside the corpses of Daniel and Richard, amidst the devastated scene of a fateful night. It was all over, but the price was too high. The Hudson River flowed silently in the darkness, the icy water washing away blood and ash from the sandy shore. But it couldn't erase the stench of death that clung to the air. Maya knelt on the damp sand, clutching Ethan's lifeless body, her final scream lost in the wind whistling through the tall pine trees. Her brother, the last of her remaining family, was now just a cold corpse, his blood-soaked shoulder staining her dress, his eyes closed with a faint smile, a silent farewell. A few meters away, Daniel and Richard's bodies lay motionless, their blood spreading into dark pools under the dim moonlight, their faces twisted in the final expressions of pain and hatred. The distant warehouse was reduced to ashes, a smoldering ruin, a mass grave for the souls lost in this nightmare. Maya laid Ethan down on the sand, her trembling hands smoothing his short gray hair, but no warmth remained. Blood from the wounds on her body, the bullet graze on her shoulder, the glass cuts on her legs. The split lip from Daniel's slap had dried into dark streaks on her brown skin. Her tattered wedding dress, once as pristine as her dreams, was now a cloth soaked with blood, ash, and river water, a stark reminder of the cruelty of her fateful wedding day. She stood up, her bare feet trembling on the cold sand, her empty eyes gazing towards the river. But in her heart, there was no peace, only a black void where her family, her love, and her former self had been incinerated. The sound of a distant engine cut through the deathly silence. An ambulance sped towards them, red lights flashing through the darkness, followed by 2 police cars with blaring sirens. Maya didn't run, didn't resist, just stood there, a ghost amidst the blood-soaked sand. The vehicle stopped, and a group of people stepped out, paramedics with pale faces, police officers with guns drawn. They saw her, saw the three bodies, and no one spoke for a few seconds. A police officer, tall with a stern face, stepped forward, pointing his gun directly at her. "Maya Johnson," he said, his voice hard, "you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. Kneel down and put your hands up." Maya didn't kneel. She looked at him, her bloodshot eyes unwavering. "Murder?" she repeated, her voice hoarse with sarcasm. "They killed my family. They killed each other. I just survived." The officer frowned, but didn't lower his gun. "That's for the court to decide," he said. "Kneel down or I'll shoot." Maya laughed a dry, lifeless laugh. "Shoot," she said, her voice challenging. "You think I have anything left to lose?" But before he could pull the trigger, a paramedic rushed forward, pushing the gun down. "She's badly injured," the young woman shouted, her voice trembling. "She needs to be taken away immediately." Maya didn't resist as they pulled her towards the ambulance, handcuffing her to the stretcher, her empty eyes fixed on the dark sky above. The click of the handcuffs was like a period at the end of her fate. "You'll be taken to the station after your wounds are treated," the officer said, but his voice now held a hint of hesitation as he looked at the horrific scene on the riverbank. The ambulance sped away, leaving behind the blood-soaked sand and the bodies of Ethan, Daniel, and Richard, the three people who had dragged Maya's world into hell. Inside the vehicle, she lay still, her eyes closed, but her mind was spinning. She saw her mother, Grace, falling into flames at St. Augustine's Church, her hands reaching out as if to grasp her. She saw Ethan, pushing her out of Richard's bullet, sacrificing his life so she could live. She saw Daniel, the man she once loved, turned into a monster by jealousy and Richard's lies. And she saw Richard, his twisted smile as he confessed everything a revenge plan years in the making to destroy her family for a case her father had testified in. The horrific aftermath wasn't just death, it was the emptiness she would carry for the rest of her life. Her family was gone, her love was dead, and her very being was shattered. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, the doctors rushed her into the emergency room, bandaging her wounds, administering painkillers, but no one could heal the scars on her soul. She woke up a few hours later, lying on the hospital bed, her empty eyes fixed on the white ceiling. A police officer stood guard outside the door, but she didn't care. She had survived, but the price was too high. 6 months later, on September 14th, 2025, a trial was held at the local courthouse, not far from where St. Augustine's Church once stood. Maya sat in the dock, her hands cuffed, her face gaunt, her eyes deep but still burning with an inextinguishable fire. The scars from those bloody days had healed, but they were permanent reminders of what she had endured. The courtroom was packed, the press headlined "The Bloodied Bride." Locals whispered about the horrific tragedy, and the curious wanted to know the fate of the woman who had survived hell. The prosecutor stood up, his voice echoing. "Maya Johnson is accused of murdering Daniel Carter and Richard Marshall, along with causing the deaths of dozens in the St. Augustine's Church and Hudson River warehouse fires. This is a series of heinous crimes that cannot be tolerated." He presented evidence, the bloody dagger, the paramedic's testimony, and the video from the USB drive she and Ethan had watched. But Maya's lawyer, an elderly man with calm eyes, countered, "My client is the victim of a cruel conspiracy. She acted in self-defense to protect what was left of her family." Richard Marshall confessed everything in the video. He was the mastermind, and Daniel Carter was his tool. The trial lasted for weeks, with heated arguments and horrific details exposed. Maya said nothing, just sat there, her eyes gazing into the distance. She didn't plead for mercy, didn't expect sympathy. She just wanted the truth to be revealed, even if it couldn't bring her mother and brother back. A surprise witness was called the firefighter who had helped her watch the video from the USB drive. He stepped onto the stand, his voice trembling. I saw her try to save her brother on the riverbank. I saw her refuse to run, even though she could have. She's not a murderer. She was pushed to the edge. His testimony swayed the jury, but the prosecutor didn't yield. He called another witness, a survivor from the church fire, who claimed to have seen Maya holding a knife as she faced Daniel. She's a danger, he concluded. After 5 days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Maya was sentenced to 10 years in prison for manslaughter in the deaths of Daniel and Richard, along with indirect responsibility for the warehouse fire. There was not enough evidence to convict her for the church fire, but the sentence was still a heavy blow. When she heard the verdict, Maya didn't react. She just nodded slightly, as if it was something she had long prepared for. Her lawyer grasped her hand, whispering, "We can appeal." But she shook her head. "No need," she said, her voice low. "I did what I had to do. Now I just want peace." Maya was taken to a women's prison hundreds of miles from her old town. She lived in a small cell, day after day, passing in silence. She didn't communicate with anyone, didn't participate in prisoner activities, just sat by the small window looking out at the gray sky, where clouds drifted like ghosts of the past. But the horrific aftermath didn't end with the sentence. A year later, an unsigned letter was delivered to her by a guard. Inside was a handwritten note. "I'm still alive. You think you won, but I'll make you pay." Maya read the letter. Her hands didn't tremble. She recognized the handwriting. Richard, somehow, had survived Daniel's bullet. He didn't die on the riverbank that night. Perhaps he was saved by someone, or he escaped in the chaos. She looked at the note, and a cold smile appeared on her lips, the smile of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. She burned the letter with a match borrowed from another inmate, the small flame flaring up, consuming the note as she had once wanted to consume Richard. But that letter wasn't the final shock. 2 months later, news spread through the prison in hushed whispers. A massive fire had broken out in Maya's old town, where St. Augustine's church once stood. The field of weeds there was burned to the ground, and in the ashes, a charred body was found with a silver ring engraved with the letter on its hand. No one knew for sure if it was Richard or another victim, but the rumor spread quickly that he had returned for revenge, only to die in the very flames he had used to destroy Maya's family. Maya heard the news from a guard, and for the first time in over a year, she cried. Not with joy, not with fear, but with the final release of her pain, the pain of someone who realized that even the death of her enemy couldn't erase the horrific aftermath of what had happened. She sat in her cell, head in her hands, and whispered to her mother and Ethan, "I'm sorry. I couldn't protect us." But in the darkness of the prison, Maya didn't completely break. She began to write scribbled lines on scraps of paper, telling her story, her family's story, and the story of the flames that had consumed everything. She sent them out through a released prisoner, and one day they would become a book, a warning, a reminder of the price of hatred and betrayal. She didn't seek forgiveness, didn't expect salvation, but she wanted the world to know that she had survived, even if she was just a shadow of herself. The horrific aftermath wasn't just the death of those she loved, wasn't just the prison sentence, but the truth that she would forever carry that pain, like a scar that would never heal. And in the darkness of her cell, Maya whispered to herself, "If there's a next life, I won't let anyone touch my family again." That was her final vow, echoing in the silence between the cold walls of a shattered life. The story unfolds against the backdrop of a wedding a day that should have been filled with joy and happiness, but instead turned into a tragedy of pain and chaos. This reflects the reality that life is never as simple as we imagine, and unexpected events can happen at any time. Maya and Daniel's wedding day was not just a personal event, but also a symbol of the relationships, hopes, and dreams that everyone carries. However, when misunderstandings and distrust arise, all good things have the potential to be destroyed. The characters in the story represent many aspects of modern society. Maya, with her sincere heart and desire for love, becomes helpless in the face of baseless accusations and hatred from the one she should have loved the most. Daniel, despite appearing strong, is dominated by jealousy and his own weaknesses. Both characters are unable to escape external influences, from society to the hidden enemies who want to ruin their lives. One of the important lessons from the story is the power of communication. Daniel and Maya did not talk to each other clearly and sincerely about their worries and suspicions. If they had been able to sit down and resolve their misunderstandings together, perhaps their wedding would have taken place in a completely different atmosphere. Silence and false assumptions created a tragic ending that neither side wanted. In addition, the story also shows that hatred and resentment can lead to unforgivable actions. Daniel's enemy did not simply want revenge, but also wanted to witness the destruction of an entire happiness. This prompts us to reflect on our surroundings, whether we ourselves can inadvertently become negative people who hurt others. We need to be responsible for our words and actions, as they can leave deep consequences in the lives of others. The story also speaks to the need for empathy and understanding. Maya, despite her suffering, did not lose her humanity and found a way to stand up against injustice. Her actions, though momentarily uncontrolled, demonstrate the inner strength of a person who wants to protect herself and her rights. Meanwhile, Daniel allowed jealousy and confusion to lead him astray, leaving irreparable wounds on both his soul and body. Finally, the story touches on the painful reality that life brings many uncertainties, and we cannot always control everything. Loss, pain, and unexpected events will always be a part of the journey of life. However, we can learn from these experiences to become stronger, wiser, and able to accept challenges.